Infant formula is worth nearly $2 billion a year to the New Zealand economy. And the industry here has managed to build that with a product that's so heavily regulated that all formula is basically the same. But there are changes on the horizon, with Food Standards Australia and New Zealand planning updates to the rules that would be world-leading.
Stoush is brewing over infant formula, with one manufacturer threatening to pack up and leave the country if the government signs up to new standards.
The Dairy Companies Association of New Zealand has lobbied heavily against the changes, and the Infant Nutrition Council isn't happy either.
We don't see the problem that's trying to be solved by these additional restrictions.
I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, marketing, lobbying, conflicts of interest, an industry backdown and a ministerial flip-flop over the infant formula industry. RNZ investigative journalist Anusha Bradley's been over developments, and I asked her to start at the beginning.
Well, it all started around 2012, so about 12, 13 years ago now, when the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, this is a joint body that regulates what food is prescribed and how it looks and how it's sold in Australia and New Zealand, they decided that they needed to update the rules and regulations around baby formula because the current guidelines, the current standards, are about 20 years old. So they did a big review and they issued like 36 public reports for comment, consultation. They held various rounds of consultation. They did 5 market studies over the last decade. And the conclusion of all that work was that there was some impact to businesses by upgrading these regulations, but the overall benefit, there was an overall public benefit to families and babies by making these changes. And so after all this work, New Zealand was really set to adopt the new standards, but really in the last few months before that decision was made, what I found out is there was a lot of lobbying from just a handful of formula companies that really changed the government's mind, and they opted out. So New Zealand will now create its own baby formula standards.
All right, we'll get to the lobbying in a sec, but what were the changes?
So basically, baby formula is one of the most highly regulated products in New Zealand, maybe even the world, because they're such vulnerable people, babies. And so every little thing from how it's formulated, the ingredients, the colour of it, what even the packaging look like, has to meet really strict rules. And so what they did, Fazans did, is they looked at the latest scientific research and they came up with a new formulation of what baby formula should contain. And it's important to note that the industry agreed with what the composition of formula should look like. So there was no dispute about what the ingredients that formula should contain, but where the sticking point was is how it should be sold. And Fazans recommended that there were some labelling changes on the front labels of formula tins that companies would no longer be able to make ingredient claims. They wouldn't be able to put certain ingredients on the front of the label. So at the moment, you can buy formula that advertises we've got probiotics, we've got certain ingredients that might make your baby healthier, less fussy, sleep longer, etc., etc. And the issue with that is that the public health experts tell me is that there's those kind of claims, those ingredients often aren't really backed by strong science. So the recommendation was that they should not be advertised. They should only be listed on the back of the formula packets. And this is where the trouble started. The formula companies were quite opposed to those 2 particular changes.
Right, because if you have a product that essentially has to be the same as everybody else's product, these are the little things that put you ahead of the game, right?
Yeah, so basically, essentially, because formula is so highly regulated, all formula is pretty much the same. And it's guaranteed to provide the same nutritional content, whether it's the cheapest formula or the most expensive. And so because there are already restrictions around how formula can be sold, so the industry here in New Zealand and Australia adheres to a voluntary self-regulated code of practice where they've agreed not to advertise formula for babies up to 12 months old. So really what's on that front label is just so important because that's the only marketing tool they have. So listing things like, we've got probiotics, we've got this kind of milk protein, is really sort of the only marketing tool they have. So it's really quite important to their business. And they argued that this was really important because in New Zealand, most of our milk products are exported. I think we export about 2 billion worth of formula products a year, half of that going to China. And that Chinese market is really important to companies like Danone and the A2 Milk Company that sell about $1 billion of formula to China each year.
Well, I mean, it's important to New Zealand though, right? As well.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think the companies argued that, this is a huge industry. In New Zealand, it employs hundreds of people and hundreds of jobs. It's a huge export earner. So it's important. But then I guess the other side of the coin is that because all formula is essentially the same, are parents buying formula they don't necessarily need or expensive products that maybe don't do what they're promised they say they'll do.
And that is a concern to baby experts, including Gergely Toldi.
I have a dual role. I work at the Liggins Institute at the University of Auckland as a researcher and scientist. My research is about immunology and how the immune system develops in babies, broadly speaking. And I also have a clinical role at Starship Hospital at the neonatal intensive care unit where I work as a neonatologist. So I look after preterm and sick-term babies.
So when formula is being mixed up for these wee ones, do you know what kind of formula you're mixing?
No, I actually don't. None of the nurses or the other doctors do. So I think the way it works is that the various brands kind of rotate in the hospital, but we don't actually know what brand we're using at the time.
So it's a very fraught time when you've got a new baby, especially if it's a first baby. And mums who can't breastfeed are faced with this dilemma, which formula? What do you say to them?
That's right. I actually have a quote from an interview from a new mum from the UK, which says, is there a difference between formula milks? You have absolutely no idea, and it's such a scary world being a new parent. And I think that describes it all. And yes, it can be confusing. We often get that question from new parents, particularly if it's their first baby, just before they go home from the hospital. And what I normally tell them is that they can just go with whichever brand they like and they can just use the cheapest formula. They're not going to disadvantage their baby by not buying the most expensive product available.
So essentially then, most commercially available formulas, you go to the supermarket and there are different sorts of tins of them, they're all the same?
You could say that, although the manufacturers add different extras, if you like, different additives such as probiotics, prebiotics, various types of proteins, fatty acids, and that does make a difference, so that the actual composition will be different. But whether those extras actually deliver, the claims that they make about them on the labels and in adverts, that's the big question.
So with all the competitors, marketing is the difference.
It is. It's a big industry in the sense that obviously formula milk is widely used in society, but there's basically only a handful of major players, so it is competitive and it works with huge profit margins.
So when it comes to the marketing, to what you put on the tin, you sort of can't blame the companies for putting the best foot forward, if you like.
Yes, obviously there is this aspect of marketing. They basically want to sell their products. And I think giving them the benefit of doubt, there's probably good intention as well in some regard behind promoting those components that they believe can make a difference to a baby's development. The problem is that most of those claims are unfounded in the sense that there's no scientific evidence behind those claims. And I think the other consideration is that, like we said, this is a very vulnerable period for many families for various reasons. And formula milk will always be second best compared to breast milk. And that's not to say that formula milk doesn't have a place in society. There are many families who have no other options because they don't have a good milk supply, for example, or they just simply choose to use formula, which is also absolutely fine. but we'll never be able to fully replicate breast milk when it comes to formula products and those different components.
So at the moment, when you're in the supermarket looking for the best way to formula feed your new baby, there are all sorts of added extras you can grab if that appeals to you. For example, additions claiming to support brain development or strengthening immunity. The trouble is, as Gergely says, the claims are often not backed up by robust clinical scientific evidence. The new standards would stop companies putting such claims or even saying what these extra ingredients are on the front of the label. And if they can't do that in New Zealand, they can't do it in China, where most of our formula goes. Here's Jonathan Chu again. He's the CEO of the Infant Nutrition Council.
It would put us out of step with how international regulations, the Europeans, for example, how they label formula.
When they export to China, they would argue that parents, especially in China, they really value certain ingredients in their formula. So they want to be able to see their certain ingredients, and they want to be able to see that on the front label. And if that ability is removed in New Zealand, there's some strange, quite tricky Chinese regulations that says that you can't just put a Chinese label on it with the ingredients. You have to have the same label as in New Zealand. So that really it means they can't compete with other companies that are importing from Europe, for example. So, yeah, they're really worried about losing that market.
And are they still allowed to say made in New Zealand on the label?
So originally in the draft guidelines, that was going to be removed, but the industry presented an argument and that actually was not in the final regulation. So they can still say made in New Zealand, which is a key differentiation and a key selling point, I guess, for formula companies.
Another aspect of the changes, which the industry here pushed back against initially but has now agreed to, is that formula with medicinal aspects to it, such as reflux treatment or for babies with lactose intolerance, would only be allowed to be sold in pharmacies. There's a couple of reasons for that. It would hopefully stop parents buying expensive formula that they really don't need. And it would discourage off-the-shelf solutions to problems that aren't really problems.
There's quite a large body of international research here which shows that, the marketing of these, some of these formula products that says, oh, look, this will help with reflux or colic. They argue that the formula industry has pathologized some of these quite normal conditions that babies go to. It's just a developmental thing. So you don't necessarily need a particular formula to deal with that. It's just a developmental stage. So there's that concern that parents are being persuaded to buy these products when actually they probably don't really need them.
Gergely Toldi says, on the other hand, some babies with feeding issues would benefit from specialist milk products, but parents should go through healthcare providers for that advice.
For example, for babies who have bad reflux, who spill a lot or have regurgitation, they have reflux milk available, which basically is a thicker version of a standard formula milk. It contains a thickener, and it works for some babies. It's unnecessary for most babies. The reason why we think these products are better sold through specialist outlets such as pharmacies or through healthcare providers is because some of these babies actually need more healthcare provider input or medical input to investigate their symptoms, and telling parents or suggesting that if you just choose this other type of formula will fix it is not entirely true and actually can cause delays in diagnosing, for example, more serious problems.
So if you've got a baby that vomits a lot and, you can wander in the supermarket and something says, this is great if your baby vomits a lot, actually there could be more going on there. You really need to whip back to the doctor and have things sort of tested.
That's right. And vomiting, for example, is a really common thing in babies. So most babies don't really need anything done about it. It can be a scary symptom for parents, if you like, particularly for new parents. But actually, if you have a baby who vomits a lot and you walk into the supermarket, you see various options. You can get the reflux formula, which is for regurgitation. You can get the hydrolyzed formulas, which have the protein component broken into smaller chunks. because having cow's milk allergy or insensitivity can also be associated with vomiting. So how do you know what the issue is? At the end of the day, it's just a symptom. And I mean, you can start experimenting, but it's probably easier just to ask someone who can give you advice. And these, of course, needless to say, these products are more expensive than your standard formula.
Now, there's another complication to this story.
The Food Safety Minister is facing criticism over potential conflicts of interest after it emerged his sister advised his office against introducing tougher regulation of baby formula. Andrew Hoggard was among senior ministers who were intensively lobbied by a handful of companies opposing Trans-Tasman infant formula standards, which were later dropped by the government.
So what I found out is that behind the scenes, the handful of formula companies really were involved in quite extensive lobbying of ministers around these proposals. They had lots of meetings. They sort of bombarded ministers with letters and emails and calls, and ultimately the government opted out. Since then, though, my understanding from sources within the industries is that they actually really do want to join into the food standards with Australia, if they can get an exemption for these two labelling issues, which is they're allowed to still label ingredients on the front of the formula packet, and also the kind of protein, such as saying like made with A2 protein. So those are the issues that they're trying to get around, and I understand that they're really pushing the government now to try and negotiate these exemptions with the Australian government and opt back in. The industry says that this was always their preferred option, but they weren't able to achieve that last year, and so they really lobbied the government to opt out. So my understanding is that the Food Safety Minister, Andrew Hoggard, he's seeking advice on various options, one of which includes trying to negotiate these exemptions with Australia and possibly opting back into these standards.
I need to be discussing this not only with Australia, but also potentially Cabinet. So, I mean, for me, where I want to get to is in a place where we're utilising the best of that standard, whether or not we copy and paste it, or we're able to modify it, get back in. Those are discussions I want to have face-to-face with people, not via the media.
We do have about 5 years. I think Australia will opt into these standards in 2030. New Zealand has said in the meantime we'll look at creating our own. So we do have a couple of years to decide how we're going to proceed.
But it's not a good look, is it? If a body like the Australian-New Zealand Food Standards does a lot of research on a modern science, establishes new standards, and New Zealand decides not to go with them, that surely is not a good look for the industry.
I think this is at the heart of the whole issue, and I guess what these stories show is the power that corporations can have when a government is looking at a decision based on public health and based on research and evidence, that these possibly can be persuaded otherwise because of the power of lobbying by these corporations. So you really have to ask the question, yes, there possibly were jobs at stake, maybe export sales would be affected detrimentally, but what was the overall public good here? And public health experts would argue that maybe the government should have been a bit more sceptical when they were faced with threats from these companies that they would leave New Zealand, that products would be withdrawn if these changes went ahead. Maybe the government should have really based its decision on the scientific evidence rather than maybe persuasion.
You can call their bluff.
Possibly.
Yeah. Well, of course, it doesn't help Andrew Hoggard that his sister is one of these lobbyists. It's really not a good look. Political scientist Bryce Edwards calls this a textbook case of conflict of interest. What does Hoggard have to say about that?
Well, what I found out is that Minister Hoggard's sister, Kimberly Cruther, is the Executive Director of the Dairy Companies Association of New Zealand. So they represent dairy exporters and manufacturers. Only some of those are infant formula companies. And she was invited to meetings with the minister's office, and she received a text from someone in his office saying, oh, look, those issues you raised about their standards, they're now resolved. So DCANZ was really opposed to a previous regulation that would have prevented companies from saying that their formula was made in New Zealand. When that was resolved, Andrew Hogarth said that his sister DCANZ dropped out of the sort of the debate, I guess. But she was actually invited to meetings after that. She didn't attend. She did actually provide some technical advice around whether the standards met with international regulations. She opposed that. She said they didn't. So the question here is I guess, was her being involved, is that a perceived conflict? How is that managed? The minister did declare that perceived conflict, that potential conflict with his sister and his brother, who actually also works in the dairy industry. But we don't really know the details of how that conflict is managed. And I think that was the issue that Bryce Edwards was trying to raise, is that Andrew Hogarth told me that, well, he just doesn't talk shop with his family. And it's kind of hard to imagine, like Christmas or family gatherings, not talking about sort of
work.
What you do at work. But maybe that does happen. I don't know. But I guess the point is that enough? Do we need more certainty? Do we need greater rules around how these things are managed?
Well, it's not like there's no history of lobbying and undue influence in this coalition government. It's been a pattern, hasn't it?
I think we're seeing with issues like the repeal of the smoke-free legislation, issues around vaping. My colleague Guy Nesbitt has done a lot of work in this area around lobbying and its impact around the smoke-free legislation. And we are seeing what appears to be the power of corporates, their interests are being put ahead of public health.
It's sad to see that the industry or specific manufacturers have such a great influence on policy making and decision making at such a high level. And that's in the context of not offering alternatives, for example, milk banks, or improving milk donation practices in New Zealand, which obviously would be an alternative to using formula. But
so that's women who have too much breast milk donating it.
That's right. And currently there's no national network of milk banks in New Zealand. There are a handful of milk banks.
There's not even one in Auckland, is there?
No, there isn't one, which is really strange for such a big city with number of population. So I think that, that's kind of an indication of where the priorities are. And on a more general level, I think it's also sad to see that the decision making is not evidence-based, essentially. So the formula standards that are under discussion were developed over several years by Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, involving various experts and actually looking at the scientific evidence, not just nutrition science, but also things like social sciences, what impact marketing has on parents and babies, things like that. And so that's kind of sidelined. And I think the U-turn that we see now is probably also a good indicator of that evidence-based policy making is not really happening. It's all kind of dictated by the actual interests of the industry.
It's a really crucial industry for New Zealand, right? It's a highly prized product in Asia. It employs hundreds of people here in New Zealand. But at the end of the day, it's like a product that, it's for the most vulnerable people in our society, for wee babies. And, should we have the utmost protections for them and their caregivers? Should we have rules that stop parents being unduly influenced by marketing tactics? Should parents be paying high prices for formula they don't really need? And it's not about demonising formula companies or demonising people that use formula. It's just about making it a product that's available in a safe way where there's no marketing influence there.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Phil Benge. Thanks to Anusha Bradley and Gergay Toldi. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite.